The Wagner Society of New York has known Hilan Warshaw for several years. He's been a speaker at several of our annual seminars. He has also written about film and the arts for a number of publications, and he taught a course on Romanticism and film here at Barnard in 2011. This film is being screened by several U.S. Wagner societies. It has already been seen in Minneapolis and Chicago, and will be soon in Boston and other venues here and abroad. Hilan has made many films about the arts, but this is the first with such extensive development and with international and TV distribution. We're pleased that Lydia Guerre offered to develop and chair the panel, which will follow this screening. She's professor of philosophy at Columbia University, and she's also taught at Berkeley and has been visiting professor at other universities and is a frequent participant at scholarly conferences. She's authored many books and is published in many scholarly and music journals. Lydia will introduce our panel following this screening. Now we look forward to the film. Thank you for coming.
I'm Lydia Guerre of the Department of Philosophy, Professor of Philosophy at Columbia University, and thank you very much to the Wagner Society for organizing this. I'm going to be brief in my introductions because descriptions of our eminent panelists are in your brochures, and I'm sure that we have many things to discuss. So first of all, also congratulations to the filmmaker, Hilan Warshaw, and Midget, a very dear friend of mine from the Washington Times, formerly of the New York Times. Philip Kitcher, a very dear colleague and friend of mine from the Department of Philosophy, who has performed, I think, in the Wagner Society a few times, and Stuart Klawans, who writes for The Nation. I'm going to begin with Philip.
Well, thank you very much, Lydia. I'd actually like to begin by thanking the Wagner Society for arranging this event, and also by congratulating the filmmaker. I found this quite a powerful film, and I didn't expect to. I'm one of those people who want to become forgetful Wagnerites. That is, I want to listen to the music, and I want to acknowledge at the very beginning that the man was utterly vile, that he wrote a lot of drivel, a lot of rubbish, and a lot of very harmful rubbish, that he lived in a society that had profound tendencies to anti-Semitism, but he himself contributed to those and in many ways exacerbated them. I'd like to get beyond that. I'd like to listen to the music. I'd like to think about the operas and the dramas. And I came in thinking, why do we have to keep probing this sore? I think one of the effective things about the film is the way it begins and ends by reminding us of why people feel they have to keep coming back to this extraordinarily gifted, marvelously brilliant musical genius who had such loathsome moral and political and social views. We have to keep coming back to it because of what happened later, which Wagner, as Leon Botstein in the film beautifully points out, did not foresee. He may have intended something like it. Who knows how to read those remarks that occur in his prose? But by framing it in the context of the playing of Wagner's music in Israel, in a community which has taken in those who suffered so much from a movement that glorified Wagner, it really reopens this question. It really makes it, for me, something that made me chide myself. You can't be that lazy, I said to myself during the movie. You can't really avoid this. Can you really separate the man from the music? Well, I agreed with almost everything Botstein said in his interviews in the movie, and I was very glad he was so prominent in it. I was a little disappointed that we didn't get to hear from Daniel Barenboim himself, I have to say. But I thought Botstein was very good, except in one regard, and that is he described on Judaism in music as constructing an ideology. you know, it's actually a rather poor essay. It's very thin intellectually. It's clearly an emotional response. It's something that doesn't develop its ideas with any clarity or any particular definiteness or any particular persuasiveness. What it has going for it is a bunch of savage jibes at Jewish people, and one example that gives rise to this notion of imitativeness that runs through the essay. The Jews are the great imitators, and that's the case of Mendelssohn. Wagner in it makes much of the idea that Mendelssohn was a big fan of Bach and revived the oratorio, and he couldn't really do it because, of course, you know, he was outside it. All of this that's a relatively nice part of the essay. But as a piece of writing, it's extraordinarily bad. And I think Wagner's own self-judgment when he said that he was very poor at working out ideas in prose was absolutely right. So I don't think there's much that we can learn that illuminates the music from reading Wagner's writings. I think we can become extremely dispirited about the man. I think we have to situate him in the context of a complex political situation in the Germany of the 19th century. But what I really liked about the movie is it brings it right down into the dirt and the difficulty of careerism. It makes Wagner in some ways seem incredibly petty. All of this is about relationships that are working themselves out in his finding his way into musical prominence and then maintaining his position as a very prominent musical figure. And I think that's a very successful part of the movie. That narrative line, a bit of the sociology of the aspiring, ambitious, self-styled genius. Now, I've worked in my capacity as somebody who writes about philosophy in the arts on Wagner, on Thomas Mann, and on James Joyce. And they all three have something which this movie makes very, very clear. They devour the lives of those around them. And those around Wagner were particularly vulnerable because they were passionate about the culture, and of course, they were second-class citizens. And what comes across from the movie, to me, is how Wagner exploited that fact, exploited it with great skill, and until Hermann Levy stood up to him without any mercy whatsoever. I'd like to get beyond the movie. I'd like to get beyond the issues. I'd like there to come a day, and it was a lovely way at the end where the question was raised, where we can simply listen to the music. I thought one of the great features of the movie that reminded us of the fact that even when we think about the music, it may be difficult. The portrayal of the first act of Siegfried and Mime in his stereotypical guise. That, for me, is one of the chilling moments, and that act seems to me the most difficult part of The Ring to come to terms with, because of what happened in the middle of the 20th century. But the other moment is the end of Meistersinger and the return to German folkishness. And that's, I think, another moment that's very difficult to get beyond. So even if we can free ourselves eventually from Wagner's anti-Semitism in its 19th century context and these appalling, rubbishy writings that he wrote, it seems to me we're still going to have to face up to the fact that there may be echoes in places in the music. So I'd like very much to be a forgetful Wagnerian, but this movie is a powerful reminder, I think, of the difficulty of doing that.
We can't be forgetful for at least an hour, but Stuart, please.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for having me. I'd like to begin by amplifying something that Philip said perhaps looking at it from a slightly different angle, the angle of someone who deals with film criticism. I believe that Hilan, is that the way it's pronounced, Hilan?
Hilan.
Hilan. I believe that most of your filmmaking work has been as an editor up until now.
Yeah.
Which interests me. Editing is the part of filmmaking that is most like musical composition. And one can see that this is a very well-composed film. One thing that interests me, and this goes to what Philip was saying, is Hilan's decision to frame the film with the question of whether Wagner should be performed in the state of Israel. This goes to the issue of whether one can value the music for its own experience and divorce it from the historical experience, as Philip said. The remainder of the film within this frame is very well edited, very well put together to bring you back into the historical period, sometimes with these performances that are staged as if in the period, and so forth. What interests me in this is that my own impetus is to try to go back into that period. We all know it's all too easy to just enjoy the arrogance of the present, to have our own opinions and feelings about what's right and what's wrong. Hilan has gone beyond that with examining the issues of careerism, not only what Wagner got out of the Jews in his circle, but also, very interestingly and tellingly, what Jewish audiences and Jewish professional musicians got from Wagner. It's a very difficult bargain, less difficult of a bargain, it would appear in the film, the way it's presented, for the audiences. And I thought that Botstein spoke very well about the situation of Jews in the German-speaking world at that time and what culture meant to them, culture as it was defined then. But to me, the appeal of the film, what pulls me in and what I care about, is not the experience of the audience in general, not the experience of Richard Wagner. It's the experience of these Jewish professionals who dealt so closely with him. That, to me, is at the heart of it. I found the portrayal, especially of Hermann Levy, to be deeply affecting and deeply troubling. Tausig as well, of course. But when I look at a film, I look at what's in the film, and then I also look at what's outside the frame. So if it's not too much, I want to just speak of what's outside the frame here. The larger context, which is could perhaps add more. There is one reference to the pogroms in the Russian Empire, a very pointed reference and very necessary. But the larger situation in Europe at the time is missing, and I feel that more of that could have contributed, not necessarily that much more, but I'll give you an example. Perhaps people in the audience know the story of Eliza Davis and Charles Dickens. In 1863, midway between the first publication of Judaism in Music and the republication, in 1863, a Jewish woman in London named Eliza Davis, the wife of a Jewish banker, wrote to Dickens. This was at the time when Oliver Twist was about to be republished, and she knew it. And she felt that she had the opportunity to write to Dickens because it was her husband who had bought his house in Bloomsbury, so there was a connection. She wrote to Dickens and asked him if he did not, she wrote with all the admiration that would be necessary to write to Dickens and that would come very easily writing to Dickens, and asked him, "But do you understand what a wrong you have done the Jewish people with your portrayal of Fagin in Oliver Twist?" Dickens wrote back the way one would expect an author to write back, denying everything. He was, of course, immediately defensive. He let her know that there are many characters who are very questionable morally in Oliver Twist. The only one who is Jewish is Fagin. There is no imputation that all Jews are like Fagin. And by the way, historically, this is accurate. At that time in London, the criminals in that line of work were all Jews. Then Dickens went to the printer of Oliver Twist. Part of it had already been put through the press, but other parts had not yet been put through the press of the new edition, and he revised the last part of Oliver Twist to start removing a lot of the flags about Fagin being Jewish. Then in the book he was starting to compose, Our Mutual Friend, he wrote in an entire community of sympathetic Jewish characters. So that was Dickens. So that is 1863. A Jew who does not feel any need to grovel before the man, even though he's the greatest genius in England, and a genius who is willing to write back to her, take responsibility for what he has done, see what his responsibility was to the larger community, and do something else. So this is part of the larger context that lets us know that there are other possibilities. Certainly some of this is in the film and talking about the relationship between Levi and Brahms, Levi and Joachim. So this is, the larger context is acknowledged, but the idea of choice being possible is a little missing here for me. What's also interesting from the point of view of a film made by someone who is very skilled as an editor is I believe that you did incorporate some footage from Triumph of the Will, did you not? Yes. Another example of the work of someone who is acclaimed as an artist for Leni Riefenstahl, who is acclaimed as an artist for her tremendous skill as a filmmaker. And there are people who try to excuse her relationship with Hitler and the purpose of her film because of her great skill. So to me, that was interesting as perhaps just a slight moment of criticism or self-criticism worked into the fabric of the film, which I found very interesting. I think it's a very deeply researched, very thoughtful film. I'm very grateful to Hilan for having made it. Thank you.
Anne, please.
Well, I join the thanks to the Wagner Society. I always do that. I join the thanks to the Wagner Society for having us all come, and to Hilan for forcing me to confront some of these issues. Like Philip, I have been a lazily, not like Philip in that regard, but I have been a happily forgetful or neglectful Wagnerian. As somewhat of an autodidact in the opera field, I came to Wagner purely through the music and have tried to gloss over some of the less attractive sides as, oh yes, that. And obviously we can't simply gloss over that. And there are a lot of extreme manifestations that I, sitting now as a critic at the Washington Post, incidentally, the Washington Times is a whole different ballgame. You want to get into ideology, we can go on a tangent there. Sitting there, I get a lot of perhaps some of the more extreme readers' responses from people who feel so passionately about this issue. And when the Los Angeles Opera did The Ring 3 years ago, there was a big festival around The Ring, and there was a very powerful lobby against this festival and a big push to try to get the attention of the press to say, why are we getting government money going to support this man who was so blatantly anti-Semitic? Started by a woman whose parents fled the Holocaust. It was completely legitimate. And I've never had a really good answer for that. One reason I appreciated the film was that I fear, often confronted with this kind of objection, the easy recourse is a kind of almost offensive relativizing of, oh, well, yes, at the time it was an expression of, oh, well, it's not Wagner's fault what happened later. Oh, as a female music critic, I read so much crap that male composers wrote about women that let's put it in context. Or, in the film, Botstein made the point about Barack Obama and the African-American community. That relativizing is an easy out and probably not really germane to the discussion. One of the most interesting things, and I think the reason that this issue continues to dog everybody who loves Wagner is, first of all, that Wagner is so great. There have been other reprehensible artists. Knut Hamsun comes to mind, who was simply forgotten, partly as a result of his horrible right-wing bigoted beliefs. Wagner is perhaps too important to forget, but there's also the fact that the arts are usually a little bit outside the world of literal truth, going all the way back to the dawn of Western culture. There's a slight divide between the truth in art and the truth in politics, say. And artists often have flirted with that divide or been very flattered to be taken seriously or dabbled in politics. But the truth is that very few works of art are taken literally in the political arena. And while Wagner's essay on Judaism and music is not a work of art, as you pointed out, his works do continue to express in some sense that ideology. And because of what happened with the Third Reich, because of the Nazis, there is a sense in which those beliefs were thrust into the political arena, were taken more literally, probably, than Wagner ever expected. There's a kind of ignorance of bigotry, which Botstein also referred to in the film about, well, the Jews are horrible and terrible, but, well, I don't mean you, I mean them. And that can be a kind of denial mechanism that allows us to excuse a lot of things in art. The fact that some of Wagner's ideas came to pass without his direct agency, but yet strongly influenced by him, as the film points out, means that, in a sense, we're always confronting this question to which there are no good answers. There are a lot of ways to talk about it and think about it. I don't think there's actually a resolution, and I don't quite agree that in another couple of generations we'll just listen to Wagner as another composer. He was in a way too great, and his ideas were too toxic for that to be possible, and his ideas were too potent as well. But one of the things I appreciated about the film was showing how in his society it was perfectly normal to encounter this kind of anti-Semitism, and that there were plenty of Jewish audiences who were used to swallowing it, which is a poignant thing to remember also in light of the way that German history unfolded over the next century. I lived in Germany for 11 years, and I was asked once by a friend of my mother's, how can you live in Germany after what happened? She was just never very happy that I was there. And I thought, well, plenty of Jews live in Germany now. I think I'll write an article about this to show her. And what that article uncovered is that this is never, ever a simple question. And the kinds of latent racism and bigotry that I discovered were still active, that I thought had been long worked through, were illuminating, and again, a reminder of why these discussions need to continue to happen.
Since nobody brought it up, maybe I could just throw one more theme into the discussion before you respond. But one thing I wanted to ask you about, and it's a touch critical, I have to warn you, is a choice you made about the way you wrote the text. You never referred to any of the Jews as anything but Jews. And as you know, both in Israel and in Germany and everywhere else in the world, there are many, many ways to be Jewish. There's no one way to be Jewish. No one's just a Jew anymore. That's part of an old discourse where everybody's labeled as that. And in the 19th century and going into the early 20th century, many people felt themselves German before they felt themselves Jewish. They felt themselves assimilated Jews, no longer like the Jews in the East. There was lots of Jewish anti-Semitism too. Sometimes people felt themselves neither Germans nor Jews, but perhaps part of Europe, somewhere else. Maybe they also felt themselves to be musicians. But it was interesting that not once in the text did you ever describe them as musicians. They were always Jews. And, I mean, obviously they were musicians. You didn't do an injustice to them as musicians, on the contrary. But you always referred to them as Jews. And so everybody became a Jew is a Jew is a Jew. So I just wanted to ask you about that decision. Sorry.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for these comments. I'm thrilled to hear. First of all, I just want to add my own personal echo to the thanks to the Wagner Society for putting this wonderful event together, and to Barner for hosting us. And it's certainly very gratifying to me to that aspect of the film resonated with all of you. To respond to some of the comments, it's freshest in my memory, so I guess I'll respond to Lydia's first. I'm not sure that was a deliberate decision of mine to refer to the characters exclusively as Jews. I believe there may be times when they are referred to in the light chiefly of their musical activities, or their, in Levy's case, for instance, his relevance to Brahms's work. Yes, thank you. Is that better? All right, great, thank you. My purpose definitely was to fill in the full identities of these people beyond the way that they've been treated in the discussion of this subject until now. And so I did want to spend quite a bit of time talking about each of their individual careers and achievements as a musical being. That's why it was very important for me to excerpt some of their original compositions, to really give them to basically restore to them the voice that they had. And I did want to describe the trajectory of each of their careers individually. So I would be disappointed if that didn't come through. Another way that I did try to underscore that was through the motif of silhouettes being filled in, because these people are in a sense missing. When I've heard about Wagner's Jewish colleagues referred to, most often it's as a throwaway allusion, usually as a talking point in the debate over Wagner's anti-Semitism. Well, he had Jewish friends. And I wanted to tease out the particularities of each of them, both in their attitudes towards Judaism. Hermann Levy and Joseph Rubinstein certainly make remarks where they repudiate their Jewish identity, which are featured in the film. And also not merely with respect to Judaism. So the title, Wagner's Jews, I hope that it will be understood partly ironically, because that's the way they've been seen. And I did want to sort of fill in that picture. And the visual language of silhouettes being filled in and the use of their music were certainly, for me, important parts of that. And it was important to me anyway. As far as Barenboim, I would have been happy to include him. He was contacted. He wasn't available during the production time frame of the film, but as so often happens, once that happened, I kind of constructed in retrospect a rationalization for it, which is that I wanted to speak to people who are really on the ground dealing with this issue in Israel, either people pro or contra. So people who are working, either the head of the Israel Wagner Society or Asher Fish or Zubin Mehta, who obviously is at the head of the Israel Philharmonic Orchestra, or other Israeli figures. Barenboim, I think at this point, he's seen sort of more as a visiting dignitary on this issue by many Israelis. I think if there's going to be a change in the attitude towards Wagner in Israel, my impression from the people I've spoken to is that it would happen from someone who lives in Israel and who really is active primarily in Israel. So I wanted to paint a picture of the current discussion in Israel about Wagner, primarily through people who live and work in Israel. The issue of careerism is very interesting. And I'd actually like to just talk for a bit about Judaism in music from the lens of careerism, because so much of the debate over Wagner's anti-Semitism now tends to be, well, is Wagner being unfairly targeted, unfairly vilified for his anti-Semitism? Is this somehow detracting from the appreciation of his work? And I'd actually like to turn this question on its head a little. Is it possible that Wagner's Judaism in music and the controversy that he avidly sparked during his lifetime about this has, instead of detracting from the attention paid for him, actually increased his renown, or actually increased the fascination with his work? And if you think that sounds cynical, I would suggest that Wagner himself thought of it in much those terms. Wagner was one of the first people to realize that there's no such thing as bad publicity. And when he first wrote Judaism in Music in 1950, he was struggling to make a living and hoping to do so partly as a journalist. There's a quote from him in my film that he feels an urge to commit acts of artistic terrorism. He wants to make people scared of him. In 1869, completely divorced from any external necessity, he chooses to republish it. And he does it at a very tender moment in the history of the debate over the Jews, because, as is noted in the film, the Jews had just been granted civil rights in 1869 in all the territories of Germany controlled by Prussia. Then in 1871, Prussia took control over the entire territory we now think of as Germany, and so the Jews were given civil rights in all of Germany. So Wagner chose this moment to enter this debate, and he did it very, very cunningly. There's a letter he writes to Hans von Bülow at the time where he pretty happily says that this is going to cause a brouhaha. And so, Wagner cared a lot about being seen as the bad boy of the musical world, of the artistic world. A large part of what people talk about when they talk about Wagner is the transgressive nature of so much of his work and of so much of his persona in general, and not just to do with anti-Semitism. So I frankly think that the jumping into this controversy, because as so many have noted, there were anti-Semitic currents in the society. By jumping into that and making himself the focal point, either of echoing or of echoing that or of opposition to that, he was, in a sense, helping to generate more notice for himself, more publicity. And a more recent example of this is, I just read an article where Sven Friedrich, the archivist of Bayreuth, who was extremely helpful to me in supplying materials for this film, he says in an interview that the question of Wagner's relationship to the Third Reich and the associated questions are, in the words of this article, an excellent marketing gimmick. So, is it possible that all of us today, including the anti-Wagnerians, people who preach against his work with a special fervency, is it possible that all of us today are still, in a sense, playing Wagner's game?
Maybe one of our panelists would like to come back on this theme.
Well, there is a sort of wonderfully naive belief among some anti-Wagnerians. I was on a radio show with Norman Lebrecht, the British journalist and provocateur, some time ago, and it was supposed to be a point-counterpoint, and I was supposed to be pro-Wagner, and he was anti-Wagner, because how can you possibly stage this anti-Semitic crap? And furthermore, the operas themselves are morally suspect. And the implications seem to be that people who saw Valkyrie were at risk of going out and having sex with their brother. You know, the idea that we are actually that gullible is a flashpoint for a lot of people against the work, which is, again, that misguided belief that artistic verities are somehow immediately translated into real life. But I would actually concur completely with what you say. I think Wagner would be delighted to know that he was viewed as controversial 200 years after his birth. You can see him sitting there chuckling. And because he never actually did anything against the Jews, he really did get to have it both ways. I mean, he fomented a lot of evil in his writings, but then he could say, well, look at Hermann Levy, whatever. I think he didn't actually go out and kill anybody. That two-sidedness, I'm sure you've read Brigitte Haumann's Winifred Wagner biography, and there's that very poignant moment where Winifred Wagner, this is the widow of Wagner's son, Siegfried, who ran the Bayreuth Festival all through the Third Reich and who adored Hitler, discovered that, or she tried to intercede on behalf of a Jewish maid, I think, or work colleague in any case, and because she was convinced that Hitler wouldn't actually kill them. Hitler must not have known what was going on, and that degree of naivete, and I think it was 1944, by one of Hitler's main supporters, really speaks to the kind of what I called before the ignorance of bigotry. You know, you can talk the talk, but what it actually means to walk the walk was not even in Winifred Wagner's, and she was an unrepentant Hitler supporter all the way into the 1970s. And yet she still didn't believe that Hitler would authorize the killing of her beloved colleague or maid. So I think in that sense that, yes, we are acting in Wagner's spirit, but also that Wagner got to have it both ways.
Could I pose perhaps a slightly different question that maybe you all want to come into? One way of explaining the continuing interest of the question of Wagner and Jews is either to say that the anti-Semitism belonged to Wagner's life and comes up in the writings, but it doesn't come actually into the operas, or the reverse, to say that it actually is there, though perhaps not on full display, in the operas, because after all, Wagner didn't just compose music, but composed total operas, as we know. So then the question became whether it was a decision for you not to raise the infamous case of Hanslick, who was, some said a Jew, some thought a Jew, but certainly a figure of a Jew that was taken up possibly by Wagner in the case of the composition of Meistersinger. And you didn't raise the question of Judaism in music in relation to Wagner himself, other than by showing a scene of Mima. So I just wondered whether you want to engage that topic.
Sure. Well, the first sentence to my response would be that I was commissioned to make a film that was less than an hour long. So there were a good many strands, which painfully enough I left to the side. I chose not to really address this topic because it is so subjective. As we know, Wagner mainly wrote legendary tales. He did not write tales set in his own time and place. So it's, to some extent, a Rorschach test, trying to figure out everything that he was referring to in the various things that he's writing. I certainly think that one can't rule it out. Actually, what's striking to me is when there are, sometimes you'll read a Wagnerian scholar who has no problem opining that Wagner refers to, his participation in the Dresden revolutions and in the opera that the Ring Cycle is a parable about the evils of capitalism, that, he's talking about his love of Schopenhauer, about all these things that were very current concerns for him. But this one issue that he happened to spill a tremendous amount of ink about and that seemed to be quite central to his worldview, there's no way that could be reflected in the operas because, hey, there were no Jews in the ancient Norse myths. I mean, there weren't any industrial sweatshops either, but a lot of these people have no problem seeing other aspects of Wagner's political concerns in the operas. So I do think that I understand why many people who love Wagner's works would like to be able to say, you know, that this is just, it can't have any relevance. I think that one needs to find ways of going forward with this works that entertains the possibility that it might be in there. As indeed anti-Semitic or racist content is in many artworks, sometimes as in Dickens's case with much more overtly. I didn't want to address it in the film head on because first of all, it just takes you in a different direction. And also it is so subjective. Many people speak about this, many people have ready opinions about it. For myself, I mentioned this in an interview I gave on the radio last week, but when I hear certain scenes about Mime or Kundry or Beckmesser especially, I feel that this is either 0 or 1 degree of separation from what Wagner was writing about the Jews at this time. But the person sitting next to me may feel differently. So I wanted to make a film about things that people know less about, which is these morally ambiguous relationships that he had with the young musicians and also their perspectives on that.
With the panel, yes, Philip, please.
Yeah, I actually want to differentiate the case of Beckmesser in Meistersinger from what I think is a much more troubling case, which is actually the case of Siegfried. It's not so much the case of Mime, but the case of Siegfried himself. I think it's really, really hard for us in the 21st century, or it's been hard for decades now, to make anything of Siegfried. Because he comes on stage at the beginning of the first act of Siegfried, and he's usually dressed in brown, and his shorts are usually, his clothes are usually a bit short, and he's romping around the stage as if he were on the streets of, as it might be, Berlin in about 1933. And that seems to me to make Siegfried become impossible for us. Beckmesser is a very complicated figure. There's all sorts of things going on behind Wagner's portrayal of Beckmesser. And you can, obviously this is all about big issues about music, about romanticism, about form, about all the controversies that went on around Wagner's own style of musical composition. All of that can be separated. But the trouble with Siegfried the opera, and Siegfried the character, and this of course spills over into Götterdämmerung as well, is it's really hard to see Siegfried as anything other than a person who's acting out some of the really vile things that Wagner has written about in his, I think, rather bad writings. I just want to reiterate that point. It's not just that it's not just that they're unpleasant; they're also, from an intellectual point of view, shoddy.
I would throw in, though, that there have been productions that have taken these works from the point of view of practically every character in it. Mm-hmm. You've had productions that make Beckmesser the hero of Meistersinger, and you have productions that Francesca Zambello's Ring in San Francisco made Siegfried every bit as shoddy as you said. It was sort of a feminist critique of the Ring, and it ended up, you really thought that Siegfried was not really up to much, and thank God for the women that were able to carry it through. So there is that relativism. I mean, I applaud you for not entering into those troubled waters, because then you get 15 stage directors sitting up here with you for 2 hours.
Maybe we'll open it up to the audience, if anybody would like to ask a question.
I just have to, I'm sorry, I have to make an admission that my memory is not as good as it used to be. However, I believe that the musician we're talking about died a long time before Hitler arose. And I think that affects what we think about Wagner. I agree with the young woman there. He did nothing violently, physically, but he was entitled in a land of free speech to say whatever he wished to say. The link between the Jews who were the musicians for Wagner were not political, it was musical. These were people who had careers, who were geniuses in their own field of music, as was Wagner. And that was the link. I don't think anti-Semitism had anything to do about it, but it has a lot to do about it for us now. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please. Down here. Wait for the mic.
I was actually a little shocked as to how shallow your film made Wagner seem, just because it seemed like his entire reason for his anti-Semitism was because of a snub by Meyerbeer. At least that's how it seemed to me. Do you think that you found that to be accurate in your research, and if so, and if not, I don't know, might there have been a better way of communicating the genesis of his feelings?
I think it was several things, but I do think the animus with Meyerbeer was the chief factor that sort of pushed him and gave it a personal fervor. In the years leading up to the publication of the essay, Wagner is really trying to build up his. He's constructing an image of himself, and it's very important for him to maintain or to broadcast ideas of the artist that he wants to be perceived as. Meyerbeer was not an artist that was given great respect by many musicians. He was not very highly regarded by any more than he is today by many students of the classical Austro-German tradition, for lack of a better way of putting it. Mendelssohn, for instance, the other Jewish composer who Wagner went after in the essay, had nothing but distaste for Meyerbeer. And so it really bugged Wagner when people would compare his work to Meyerbeer's. There was a letter that Schumann wrote to him where Schumann said, "Just saw your Flying Dutchman. I love it. I think it's great how you combine Weber, Carl Maria von Weber, with Meyerbeer." And Wagner, he went a little nuts about this. I mean, his response to Schumann has a lot of exclamation points, and it says, I just can't believe that you would think I have anything to do with this guy and with this composer who he leaves a stench that even me in another country from Paris, he still turns my stomach, even though he's in Germany and I'm in Paris. And he did write to Franz Liszt when Franz Liszt wrote to him, "Tell me, in all honesty, are you the author of this anonymous article I'm hearing about?" In 1850, he wrote to Franz Liszt, "Yes." And then the next sentence was, "It's very important for me to prove to people that I have nothing to do with Meyerbeer. And I feel myself impelled to do this when I hear the remarks made even among my friends that I have anything to do with Meyerbeer." And then he says that this, meaning writing the essay, was an act that was necessary for the articulation of my perfectly reborn self. So I would say that yes, it was an animating factor for him. Obviously that in itself doesn't create all these convictions, but I do think that was the diesel in the engine.
At the risk of sounding flip, when you are, as I am, in the business of issuing criticisms to artists of major achievement and major ego, you would be surprised how thin-skinned many of them can be.
I mean, it seems to me that the film is in a tradition of exposing the shallow thoughts of people who on other occasions think very deeply about things. Just because somebody is a great musical genius and produces remarkably thoughtful and brilliant works of musical drama doesn't mean that in his or in her practical life there's always a lot of deep thought or a lot of deep caring. I mean, that's what inspires forgetful Wagnerism, right? Let's concentrate on this brilliant stuff and let's just chunk the rest of it. Send him back into the 19th century and let darkness descend upon him.
May I just throw in, do we have a moment? I just want to say that I don't think that the film actually says that the that the impetus for for Wagner's anti-Semitism was a snub from Meyerbeer, or it says rather that Wagner needed to separate himself from Meyerbeer, and he found anti-Semitism as a way to do it. So that's something rather different. Now, what isn't explored is why Cezanne anti-Semitism rather than any number of other issues with which, he had any number of clubs at hand with which he could have beat Meyerbeer, right? So why bash him over the head with that one? That's an interesting question in itself, because, as Hilan says, the film had to be just under an hour. I can understand why you couldn't go into all of that. But I think that it presents it as a more complex issue.
One path that we might take the discussion would be to talk about the anxiety of influence and how artists are always destroying their predecessors. Another might be if I may depart from my colleague Philip for a moment, you rather jumped from the one essay on Judaism in music to all of Wagner's writings, of which there's at least 26 volumes. I unfortunately have read them all. Contrary to you, I think that an enormous amount can be learned from Wagner's writings. I'm not saying that he was up to the standard of great philosophers, but nevertheless, you cannot understand his music dramas without having read opera and drama and the artwork of the future, and so on and so on. And one of the things that strikes me in these writings is how selectively read Wagner was, how well read he was, but selectively read. He chose his authors. And in forming his views in writing, as opposed to his music dramas, he borrowed an enormous amount from Feuerbach, from Hegel, from everyone, sometimes acknowledged, sometimes not. And what you see, even in Judaism in music, that I don't think there is one claim in that essay that is not also to be found in his contemporaries and predecessors in Germany, in France, in England, and so on. And so when Botstein made the mistake, as you pointed out, of talking about constructing an ideology, he by no means constructed an ideology. He inherited an ideology. And we only give him such a hard time, and he deserves it, because he happened also to write these operas. No one would be interested otherwise in him as a figure. And so there's a reason to read his writings along with his operas. But now I'm beginning to sound like a lecturer. Okay, yep. Into the audience. Questions, sorry.
Well, congratulations. This is a wonderful and a thought-provoking work. Thank you for that. I enjoyed the movie tremendously. I just was puzzled by the representation of the Israeli controversy over Wagner's music, because what I concluded from the movie is that some Israelis, and especially the Holocaust survivors, they are against performing his music live because of his anti-Semitism and Hitler's relation. While there was a much more vivid reason for the Holocaust survivors to not be willing to listen to his music live in Israel, because his music was performed all the time in the camps, and the musicians especially, they were forced to play his music in the camps as a part of the humiliation. I was wondering about your choice to not talk about that reason, while it seems, at least to me, even more powerful reason for the survivors to be against it. The claim about Wagner's music being played in the death camps is hard to verify. I was not able to find any conclusive documentary evidence. If you know of any, I'd be happy to hear about it. Well,
Well, then I would love to speak with you afterwards and to hear about that. But in fact, the survivor that I spoke to in the film, Uri Chanoch, who's very vocal in his opposition to performing Wagner, he himself said, this is not what's at the center of it, and I've heard the story, I don't know whether it's true or not, because I never heard it. However, one imagines a story came from somewhere, but the people I spoke to all agreed that the basic reason underlying that, and maybe even underlying why he would be sadistically selected for performance in the camps, was his stature as a known anti-Semite.
Yes, please.
When did you? Thank you. When did you produce the movie?
I made the film from 2012 to 2013. It was finished in March, and it was broadcast in May on Arte in Europe.
Because I noticed that you interviewed one of the composers who was presented in Bayreuth in 2011, that was, right?
Tzvi Avni.
Yes. And I actually had the opportunity to interview Paternostro once, who made that huge step forward to bring the Israeli chamber orchestra?
Yes.
Yeah, to Bayreuth itself. And the granddaughter of Wagner had a very, very hard time, but wanted to very much that it happened, that the Israeli orchestra performed in Bayreuth as a sort of way of showing that this is an important question that needs to be up for discussion. And I feel actually that your film does that in a very tremendous way to head it head on into the theme, into the questionable, how can such a great genius be so moral, you know, misguided or rebellious. I feel that it's quite extraordinary. I heard that the Wagner archives are going to be opened very shortly. Is that correct? For general research? Was that your experience?
They say so. There's still a secret cache of letters somewhere in a bank vault in Munich, from what I understand.
I see.
Of letters between Hitler and Winifred Wagner and perhaps other things. I don't know if... Yeah.
There's also a 6-hour documentary now on the
That's
subject.
also true.
Well, maybe that would further the research. Thank you.
Maybe we can... Yes, please.
In my opinion,
Would you use the mic, please?
I'm just reflect probably a Russian community in our area. And film is very informative, but always a lot of buts probably, but I have only one. I don't know why your film does not reflect German opinion on Wagner. What I'm talking about is in 1982, a German philologist, Hartmut Zielinski, gave interview to German magazine Spiegel. In this interview, he said something very terrible things. He mentioned Wagner saying that all Jews he really compares to rats, mice, trichinos, anything terrible. And what is important for me that Zielinski make a reference to Kazima diary on this type of things. I tried to investigate this myself and go through all 2,500 pages of 2 volumes of diaries. I couldn't find anything really similar to what Zielinski said. My question to you in making this film, why you didn't really make anything which reflect German, this side of opinion, which was published in a book named Richard Wagner, Ein Deutsche Argernus, by Klaus Umbach. It is not really Umbach book, it is Umbach articles in this book, which consists of 7 or 8 articles. So in other words, this was published, and was published in Germany, and it reflects some other side of Wagner. I am not talking about music.
Maybe, thank you, he could answer
And
now.
that's what...
There are so many great scholars and great and important commentators who've written about this. I wish that I'd been able to include all of them, but hard choices had to be made.
And just about getting to the hard choice of ending this, does anybody... One last question here.
I have a question. Actually, you stimulated this question. Did you discuss anything with Hilan? Because he had made one of these similar kind of comments about Barenboims not being able to conduct Wagner with true German spirit. And of course, this was published in the Spiegel, and it horrified Barenboim, who said, I've been living in Berlin all of these years, I think I'm going to move.
Tempting as it was to enter into this entire storm, I just, again, for reasons of time, it was hard to go into that.
By the way, it is a great movie.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.